I'm Mary Walter here with Vince Connies.
Well, good morning to you. I'm happy to have joining us right now James Rosen, our friend. He's a national investigative reporter for Sinclair Broadcasting, also the best-selling author of The Strong Man, John Mitchell, and The Secrets of Watergate. Knows a lot about history, especially as it relates to impeachment, so glad to have him here this morning. James, good morning.
Vince and Mary, good morning to you. Thanks for having me back.
So this impeachment process, do you think the Democrats have done enough, Adam Schiff speaking endlessly yesterday, to convince the American public that this deserves to have ever been put in front of the Senate in the first place?
Embedded in your question, I think, Vince, is the presumption that there's some segment of the American electorate that's watching this that remains persuadable of anything at all, or persuadable of some conclusion about impeachment that they might not have held in October or December 31st. And if there is such a segment of our electorate, we could argue probably safely that that this kind of proceeding, with its tedium and its pettiness and its legalese, might not be the best vehicle for such persuasion.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. My argument always is that outside of this area, like this tiny little piece of the United States, for the most part, people have made up their minds, and those that haven't are not tuned into this the way we are. I mean, we're tuned into it because it's our job. And I admit yesterday, once Adam Schiff started going on about Russia, I was done. I was like, all right, last straw, right there, finished. Even I punched out.
You know what? As long as they're tuned into this show, I think that's what we primarily need to focus on.
Well, that luckily is happening. 57 times Russia was invoked yesterday, at least 57 times Russia or Vladimir Putin. It is interesting that that topic is not actually a part of the articles of impeachment, but the Democrats dragged it along with them because they're still clinging to it. Why is that?
Well, like in any trial setting, you'll sometimes see opposing counsel try to use some kind of backdoor mechanism to introduce evidence or allegations that were not contained in the formal charges. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes this takes the form for skillful or wily counsel of asking a witness on the stand a question that they know is going to be ruled inadmissible by the judge.
Right.
But juries can sometimes never unhear that bell rung.
Sure. But it's a little unusual to drag information in that was already disproven by an extensive investigation that lasted many, many months and cost many, many millions of taxpayer dollars.
So I think we see with the prevalence of the Russia case in the ongoing argument being advanced by the Democrats in what is, after all, a set of events revolving around Ukraine. Of course, there's some connection between Russia and Ukraine, but I think here we see the influence of Chairman Nadler. Gerald Nadler of New York, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, who was avidly pursuing impeachment on the basis of the Mueller report when the Ukraine set of events surfaced. And I think it was always Nadler's determination that somehow whatever articles of impeachment were generated against President Trump, that it should include something on the Mueller report, because that was his abiding faith that particularly Book 2, the book alleging obstruction of justice, Book 2 of Mueller's report, had validity. And so I think that's why we see this so prevalently here today, because of Nadler.
And I've asked this question before of other guests. Why didn't the Republicans, why didn't Mitch McConnell in the beginning restrict this part of the proceedings? Because they could figure out how long it was going to be, how much time each side was going to have. Why didn't they restrict it to just the information contained in the articles of impeachment? So we wouldn't be hearing about Russia. We wouldn't be hearing about Les Parnas. Why did they allow this to happen?
Well, in essence, because the enemy gets a vote. And I think there's only so much Senate Majority Leader McConnell could have done to restrict the proceedings in terms of their scope, their length, their content. And I think by all accounts, he's probably done the most energetic job of that anyone could have. For example, one area on which the Majority Leader was rebuffed was the decision to admit into the trial record the proceedings of the House. Mm-hmm. Originally, I believe that was not in his plan. So he's had to give some ground as well. But by and large, I think the Republicans are going to be pleased by the end of this process with how little time it took, how swiftly it was dispensed with, and how quickly it enabled them all to go about the business of fundraising and tending to re-election.
Yeah, we do see that Republicans are mostly sticking together, with one vote exception, I think, with Susan Collins broke off. But for the most part, all these 53-47 votes have been taking place which gives us some indication of where this is going, that in the end, Donald Trump will not be removed from office. But we do see the constellation of voices outside of the Senate that are Republicans trying to influence this process as well. National Review has an op-ed this morning called "Impeachment Doesn't Require a Crime." This is the Republican publication, National Review. They say impeachment doesn't require a crime. And it starts thusly. Senate Republicans, by and large, have reached an unspoken consensus about President Trump and Ukraine. He should not have put a temporary freeze on congressional authorized aid to Ukraine, should not have dabbled with using the aid to get Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden, or a nutty theory about Ukrainian hacking during the 2016 election, and should not have kept defending his, quote, perfect call as such. At the same time, his conduct does not merit his removal from office, especially since voters will get to pass judgment on that conduct in a few months, they say. But they go on to point out that impeachment doesn't require a crime. What do you make of this National Review piece and the argument that they're making?
There's a lot to unpack there, but let's start with the last part, which is the notion that impeachment doesn't require a crime.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen some of the people who are veterans of Washington who have served in some capacity in both the Clinton impeachment trial period and today take both sides of that question. I think I'm not a constitutional scholar. I play one in drive time radio from time to time, however.
Good.
I think that probably the framers did not want to restrict the removal power to solely those instances of a technical crime. They probably foresaw that there could be some set of circumstances which would produce a genuine monster in the White House who can be monstrous short of violating statute and who would warrant removal. And of course, I'm not suggesting that applies to any particular chief executive. As for the National Review article, it mirrors, frankly, a lot of what I hear privately and off the record from many leading Republicans who feel the same way about the president's conduct on the call and the same way about what constitutes an impeachable offense. Mm-hmm. Lastly, I would simply say that I think it points us to a category, a mental category about this whole proceeding that I don't think many people have paused to consider, which is that it might not be intellectually inconsistent. There might be some intellectual consistency, let's say, in favoring the application of the asterisk to Mr. Trump through impeachment, and yet not wanting him to actually be removed from office, and in fact still wanting him to win again in 2020. Those people are out there.
When we talk about there not needing to be a crime associated with this, I don't know. I just, as a non-lawyer, I just look at this and say, this just opens up a whole Pandora's box that down the road, once we establish that, down the road, then I don't think Republicans will do it. But don't we have Democrats then trying to remove every Republican president because they don't like them and they come up with something like this?
Well, I don't think anyone who lived during the Clinton impeachment era and observed that closely imagined that we would be revisiting this entire process this quickly in our cycles of American politics. And I think that's troubling to a lot of people, and rightly so. Whether it's a permanent feature going forward, we'll see. I think we're in the infancy of the social media revolution, the digital revolution in general. The way we process and transmit and retrieve information is going to change radically from what it is right now, beyond our ken right now. And so it's hard to say what impact that will have on our discourse and our cycles of politics.
Well, I think that this National Review piece is a form of gross establishment pandering, and I'd like to get into it with you just a second, and because I do have some thoughts on this. And I want to maintain it. Well, we got to hold people through the traffic. 8:15 now. We're here with the great James Rosen, national investigative reporter for Sinclair Broadcasting. And we're talking impeachment. The topic of National Review's op-ed came up this morning. Impeachment doesn't require a crime. It's a piece that's written by the editors of National Review. They're all writing it together. And here's my pushback on this, James. I do think that this is a form of pandering to the establishment.
Gross pandering to the establishment was the indicting phrase that you used before the break.
I do think that because ultimately, this is a form of merely sucking up to establishment Washington. It's kind of, it's a cocktail party kind of permission slip, and like, look, you don't need to have a crime for impeachment. Okay, look, here's my view on it. I grant that. If Congress wants to abuse its power, it is well within its rights to do it within the terms of the Constitution. They can come along and say, okay, no crime. The House can vote for impeachment. The Senate can vote to remove the guy without a crime. But I think Jonathan Turley, the constitutional lawyer, addressed this in the House, and he made, I think, a very compelling argument for why a crime is necessary. And the necessity of it is to assure the voting public that the leaders of our country are not treated in a different way than they would be. When we're held to account by our government is because we violated the law.
And the presence of misdemeanors in the Constitution signifies what to you? Because they obviously are distinguishing between crimes and misdemeanors.
High
because
crimes
that's the very
and
phrase.
misdemeanors.
Crimes and misdemeanors.
And
Okay.
does high qualify misdemeanors or not, in your view?
Well, I get by with a little help from my friends.
See, okay, but my point is, in order to have a stable system, in order for the people to have belief in the credibility of the government, it helps to have a framework by which they can agree that somebody should be removed or impeached. And the framework for that is the one that we all live by. It's the laws of our country. So if the Democrats are not going to actually present crimes within the articles of impeachment, don't be surprised when the public acts with a revulsion that you didn't anticipate.
To some extent, this mirrors the dynamics we've seen over time with the Supreme Court nominations. There was a time when, despite the affiliation or the ideological orientation of the nominee, they generally were approved pretty almost close to unanimously. But Antonin Scalia used to explain that the reason that Senate confirmation hearings for Supreme Court justices became so acrimonious to where they are now,
Sure.
worse than ever,
Sure.
is because the American people figured out that starting under the Earl Warren period and moving forward, that the Supreme Court had a tendency to anoint itself the arbiter of all American battles over this or that issue.
Yeah.
And to say, in essence, that 9 people in robes have the wisdom to figure out what it should be and then start devising programmatic solutions. Once that became, the American people became aware of that, they became much more determined to themselves have control over who these people were, these 9 judges, basically, these 9 judges or justices. So in any case, I think that the National Review piece asks an important question, which is, should principled conservatives be in the business of separating the outcomes of Donald Trump as president with the processes of Donald Trump as president and the conduct of Donald Trump as president? That's what they're in essence asking. And they're reflecting what I think is a fairly common view amongst Republican leaders on the Hill and elsewhere, that they are uncomfortable with the behavior, but also don't want to see him impeached, think the good of the nation requires that he not be impeached, and indeed that he win in 2020. And they don't believe that is an intellectually inconsistent view.
One of the things not being discussed is that this is the first time a president in his first term has been impeached, and it's an election year. Shouldn't the bar for impeachment be higher just based on that alone? Because this is affecting the outcome of an election. This is affecting an election. This is in an election year. That's what the Democrats are doing here. They're trying to tar this president in order to prevent him from being reelected, to make him unelectable. So shouldn't the bar be higher and be a crime, not just we don't like his behavior, so we're kind of going to try to get rid of him. And we know we're not going to get rid of him, so let's just smear him to give our guy a better shot.
Well, I don't think the Constitution sets forth any distinctions as to timing of these processes. So it's I don't think that the Constitution says the bar should be higher for embarking on one of these processes simply because it's an election year. And I think the same logic, frankly, applied to Senator McConnell's thinking in 2016 about the nomination of Merrick Garland. Nowhere does the Constitution say that the Senate should not advise and consent on the president's nominees because it's an election year. So I don't think that that's a valid argument.
Well,
Well,
I mean,
well,
for us, excuse me, but for
Go
us
ahead.
as a people, shouldn't Congress be taking that into consideration? This is the first time a president's been impeached without a crime.
Again, that point right there, I think, has been disputed. The trial memorandum, anyway, of the House managers incorporates the fact that the Government Accountability Office issued a non-binding decision concluding that the withholding of the aid to Ukraine was indeed a violation of the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. So they have asserted a violation of statute. They have. But again, you ask, shouldn't the senators take into consideration the timing of all this?
Yeah.
And who's to say they're not?
Well, meanwhile, the GAO did find that Obama violated the
Thank
law.
you.
I think seven
Seven
or 11
times,
times.
7 times.
And one of them was in the trade for Bo Bergdahl, trading
Yes.
Taliban.
Yeah.
And, I mean, there's a number of times that occurred, and the Republicans never pursued impeachment. Now, you can point to the rules of the Constitution and say, look, it doesn't govern timing at all. But the Constitution does set out in its preamble to ensure domestic tranquility, and this is the exact opposite of that.
I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's a political, not a legal process. And at the end of the day, as Gerald Ford once said, an impeachable offense is anything. He was a little more ribald than this. I won't do that to the drive time crowd, but he said it is whatever the bleep the House of Representatives decides it is.
Well, whenever you stop by, I feel like the conversation we're having is much more sophisticated than the one they're having in the Senate. Thank you very much. I
Thank
appreciate
you
it.
very much.
8:23 on WMAL.
Washington's Mall.
It's fabulous.
105.9 FM.
I can't thank you enough.
WMAL, where Washington comes to talk.